The old world is a mess, but it's not as bad as you think. Stick around and I'll show you why it owes more to 3rd edition than 8th, why that's a terrible thing, how to beat Linehammer, why Warhammer Fantasy Battle was so special to me, and why this is a flaming totem to that moment in 2015 when GW lost my trust forever. My route into gaming went something along like Fighting Fantasy and Lone Wolf, where I learned to read. No child should ever use the term foolhardy at such a tender age. Followed by Hero Quest, Shadowrun, Space Hulk, and some dabbling in 40k. I knew of Warhammer Fantasy Battle the way I was aware of the ongoing existence of Tarmac. Something important, permanent, and not necessarily of personal interest, until my return to hobby gaming after a first dalliance with normal life caused by the discovery of romantic liaisons and a total lack of cash. From then on, it was like gravity, reliably permanent in a world of shifting sands. It had always been there, and for most of my life it remained there. Its there-ness was its biggest selling point, until it wasn't. The plug was pulled, and like many gamers, I emerged blinking into the light of truly engaging with independent gaming. I'd played War Machine and was a very active Malifaux fan, but I'd not had the hobby bandwidth for the kaleidoscope of options out there due to being a fairly hardcore fantasy battle tournament player. And it was wonderful, intoxicating, thrilling to see so many different ways of approaching the problem of the tabletop. And now it's back, and I'm not really sure how I feel about that. Hi, and welcome to what I hope will be an ongoing series of videos for the channel where I go into a deeper analysis of individual games. I'll be looking at the mechanics and the history of these games, as well as dropping in some personal experiences. This time I'm going to be talking about Warhammer Fantasy Battle and ultimately the old world. Before I begin, aside from a close reading of the game itself, this video has been informed by the various interviews conducted by Deg Miniatures' YouTube channel, particularly those with Rick Priestley, a link in the down there part. But for now, first off, it's worth mentioning a little about how GW views its target demographic. They think of players as part of a hobby trumpet, a broad entry point representing many people who pick up a given game for a short time, with these casual players falling off in large numbers. Those that can be kept around become more and more sophisticated and harder to appeal to as their numbers dwindle. Games Workshop has, as standard, only targeted the broad entryway of the hobby trumpet, and the design of Warhammer Fantasy Battle is part of achieving that. It has been wisely said that any game is about whatever the players spend most of their time doing. On that basis, it has also been well said that Warhammer Fantasy Battle is a game about building army lists. Far and away, this is what most players will spend most of their time doing. Now, I'm not going to examine the actual army lists in this video. If people want me to do that, please let me know in the comments and I'll be more than happy to. But this video is plenty long enough as it is. Being an army list building game means it is not a game about engaging with a tricky and fulfilling puzzle presented at the tabletop. And that's one of its greatest strengths. Let me try to explain. There are 3 things Warhammer Fantasy Battle wants to be true that army list building as a focus brings. Number 1, anyone can pilot it. Many people come to war games expecting something complex, and some people are nervous about that. They're worried that they won't be up to the task of making the game work. And in many cases, they're right. Many games are straight up hard work to pilot. Warhammer at the tabletop is simple enough that newcomers and children can run its engines. And if you're looking to funnel in a whole bunch of newcomers and children, that's vital. Number 2, it's easy to build a community around. Being told about gameplay you weren't present for is sort of like being told about a dream. There are occasional moments that, well presented, can form anecdotes, but for the most part, you had to be there. Miniatures wargames are created by 100 small moments of movement and random chance that you just can't picture from a story. So a game that happens entirely at the tabletop is extremely hard to share with other people. The process of list building, however, is entirely analytical, understandable and repeatable, and it's one that endless theory crafting conversations can be had around. It's a process that entire communities can form around, which, if you're trying to build a long-term customer base that can be easily found and engaged with, is extremely valuable. Number 3, it's chilled out to play. The average Warhammer game is won before a single model is moved. Many are won before a single model is placed on the table. It's probably significant that during the first 5 editions of Fantasy Battle, games in the design studio were played with blind deployment. In a recent essay, Gav Thorpe mentioned, back in the day, circa 1988 to 2000, Warhammer games were started blind. We set up a line of boxes and lids down the middle of the table, and each of us deployed our army in the setup we wanted without any reference to our opponent's dispositions or force composition. Which would make for much more at-the-table play if it were a method that actual players ever used. As it was, exchanging the position of 2 Warhammer units once they're deployed is so onerous, and when being attacked so risky as to be quite rare. So what you're faced with at the start of play will almost certainly be what you're fighting when battle is joined. It's technically possible to lose a Warhammer game via piloting errors, but compared to games like War Machine, Infinity or Malifaux, where a single bad decision can ruin your chances, you need to build up an accretion of bad choices to lose Warhammer that way, which is unlikely when the majority of those choices are quite simple ones of target priority. Once players started, almost all choices occur in the magic phase in most editions, a fact which makes the new Old World editions choices particularly interesting. But we'll get onto that in a little while. I want to talk about the history of Warhammer Fantasy Battle for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because by understanding when and why certain rules came about in the history of the game that the Old World is based on, we can better understand why those rules exist. Secondly, because I think that a lot of the attraction of the Old World comes from an idea that some gamers have that there was a halcyon day when Games Workshop had games created in a sort of pure haze by free-ranging game designers, and that was honestly never the case. Games Workshop, certainly the Games Workshop that created any edition of Fantasy Battle, was not, for better or worse, that much better or worse than it is now. It just feels that way because you're older now, and the same goes for me. I'd like to point out evidence for that statement, and talking about the history of the game is an easy way to do it. The creation of a game built around list building was one largely of luck rather than judgment. First edition Warhammer Fantasy Battle, the mass combat fantasy role-playing game, created far back in the mists of time in 1983 by Brian Ansell, Richard Hallowell and Rick Priestley, was a game made by a Games Workshop that primarily supplied miniatures for RPGs. Miniatures that people therefore bought in 1s and 2s. Warhammer Fantasy Battle was there to encourage people to buy them in batches. Got a Famir? Well, if you buy a handful more of them, you can play this game with them. Got a Zote? Well, actually, they're sort of weirdo loners in pretty much every edition, so you're probably okay. It was an effective and largely benign process of supporting existing ownership leading to further sales. The aim being not to get everyone to chuck out what they already have and buy a whole new set, but to use what they already own and encourage them to get more. The basic resolution systems of Warhammer Fantasy Battle are there right from the first edition. The weapon skill, ballistic skill, and strength and toughness tables will be recognisable to any recent Warhammer fan, although for some insane reason toughness is represented by a letter grade, one that is at all times directly translated into an equivalent number. In fact, the whole stat line of normal troopers would be pretty familiar, although interestingly, strength and toughness are universally lower, with humans coming in at 2 for both. That's about it for similarities to the more recent editions, although it's many of the deviations that are more interesting to look at now. Movement takes place over 2 phases, with only units that fight in close combat restricted from taking double moves, meaning that units can move, fire any weapon other than a crossbow, and move again with absolutely no penalty to hit. Given the inherent strength of shooting, a more cynical man would guess that early 80s GW had a lot of bow-armed minis to shift. Also, while the second move couldn't end within 4 inches of an enemy, the additional movement was permitted to get as close to other units as it likes. With miniatures at this time not being supplied on standardised bases, this must have resulted in endless muddling. Additionally, leadership wasn't included in a normal trooper's stat line. Races were given standard scores, but character scores made them totally moot. Characters that were supplied not with just leadership for holding troops in combat, but cool for dealing with fear and terror, willpower for reacting to spellcasting, and intelligence for doing other stuff. This is one of the 3 most obvious throwbacks to the origins of the system. This is a level of psychology far too granular for most battlefields, but hardly unusual for most RPGs of the time. The other 2 areas are a quite detailed character progression system, and most significantly, the magic system. The magic system of the first edition is a weird, clunky, and very RPG-driven beast. Spells include the ability to force your target to talk with an outrageous accent, something that outside of an RPG it's tough to imagine the worth of, and require preparation and recovery times, in some cases equal to the full length of most tabletop battles. Furthermore, the first edition requires a games master. Actually, the first 3 editions do. In first edition, their purpose is essentially to set up the table, although a surprisingly decent automated process is provided, and to deal with the more or less entirely made up magic system. Everything continues much the same through the second edition, which is essentially just a tidying up of the first edition. The Games Master has a lot more to do in the third edition. Third edition is a strange beast. Coming out in 1987, a year after the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, it possibly lost a little of its identity. It apparently had an edict handed down from on high to the designers that the game should be more complex, because that's what the customers wanted. Customer research had spoken, and lo, it shalt be so. It is also evidence that you shouldn't hand down edicts to designers, because third edition is, to put it charitably, kind of a mess. I mean, it has quarter points. Fucking quarter. This is what you need to do when pivoting a unit of cavalry on the spot, and hope they move off before being engaged in combat and causing reality to collapse in on itself. There is no information on what you do when a unit reverses this process. The use of a GM in a tabletop minis game is an interesting question at the best of times, and third edition is absolutely not the best of times. When a GM offers the chance for an infinity of narrative options, they're a great idea. When they're used to filling gaps for an incomplete rule system, they are absolutely not. Warhammer Fantasy Battle 3rd edition repeatedly requires that situations be adjudicated by the GM, such as choosing the direction of random movements and shots, aligning combatants, and whether or not a combatant is 10 feet tall. This has a few results, all of which are rather double-edged swords. Firstly, it means players can never be entirely certain of the result of their actions. On the one hand, this can result in exciting surprises. On the other, it undermines the idea of fairness in the game and, if it's a concern, makes competitive play all but impossible. Most importantly for a GW game though, where we talked about a central goal being to produce games so that anybody can pilot, on the one hand, anybody can pilot a GM'd game, but on the other, no one can. A GM'd game only needs one person to read the rules, and they don't really need to read them because their say goes. They're always right, so anyone can run them. But if you're a little less confident, if you want to return to a rule book and be told, you're right, that was right, no one can run them, because there are, in many places throughout Warhammer Fantasy Battle 3rd edition, no right answers, just the GM's call. In modern times, games like this, The Inquisitor, have found a home with more sophisticated gamers who absolutely do have that confidence. But when you're trying to appeal to the widest base of players who are the newest to the hobby, that really isn't any good to you. So the GM had to go. Along with the GM, 3rd edition is the last place that we see the route and pursuit system that had persisted from the 1st edition and will change from 4th onwards. In short, the route and pursuit system at this point makes pursuers extremely vulnerable, even to the point where in the earlier editions, pursuing a unit that leaves the table destroys the pursuers. Furthermore, it doesn't guarantee the destruction of the routing unit when caught. From 4th edition onwards, pursuit is far simpler and extremely brutal, resulting in the instant destruction of caught units. This earlier route and pursuit system is, for one thing, arcane in its resolution, sufficiently that its replacement with the later, slicker version is on balance a good thing, but it is also a step away from realism. A unit of 40 routing men can't always be instantly rendered into a non-event on the battlefield by a couple of scouts on horseback. And it's a step into a faster, more brutal tabletop game. Once the unit starts running, a single dice roll decides its fate. Now, it is worth noting that in relation to the other aim of Games Workshop games, selling miniatures, games with long drawn out pursuit systems that don't result in huge wedges of miniatures being taken off at once don't require people to have lots of miniatures to have games of an enjoyable length. In actuality, they result in games that are quite torturously long with relatively few models, particularly when miniatures aren't necessarily on movement trays and combat includes pushback mechanics. Fast and brutal when you're trying to sell plenty of miniatures is very tempting. It also creates games that appear fast moving and rush to a sudden and exciting climax, which is an easy sell. So I very much hope we don't get an edition where combat's repeatedly bogged down in fiddly short range movements back and forth at the end of every other combat. Taken as a whole, 3rd edition is mostly just a glorious mess. If you doubt me, witness the power of the pivoting pushback rule. 4th edition in 1992 was a large boxed game with separate army books, a single product entry point for players with an army book to follow on as their next step. Rick Priestley tells us this was his favourite edition, and really any player of Warhammer Fantasy Battle from 1992 onwards, or player of the old world, will recognise the vast majority of the text in 4th edition. Now, one thing I learned in researching this video that I didn't know is that Rick Priestley, along with other writers, asked for their names to be taken off of 4th edition. Not because they weren't proud of it, but because they wanted to remove the idea of a cult of personality from the rules that were being created. I say this simply because we're now in an age where Games Workshop doesn't credit creators, and I've always been critical of them for it, so I thought it was of interest to me that the idea, at least originally, came from the writers rather than management. Make of that what you will. Anyway, a certain specific sort of rot started to set in with 4th edition, the phenomena known as Herohammer. For those not aware, Herohammer is the situation whereby a single character model is more than capable of not only taking on, but roundly battering an entire unit of normal troops. At its worst, the game becomes not one of sweeping formations and battle lines holding or breaking, and more one of a total psychopath blundering their way through unit after unit. In the early editions, this tendency was kept relatively under control by a combination of relatively weak and simple magical items and heroes with randomized or lesser stat lines. There were a few elements that created the Herohammer phenomena in 4th and 5th edition. 1. Flying high. One of the great weaknesses of powerful units is the fact that they can't be everywhere at once, combined with the fact that walking through heavy artillery fire can leave even the most powerful character missing their legs. Flying rules in early Warhammer Fantasy Battle had an option called Flying High, where characters on flying mounts could move to an abstracted high area where they couldn't be shot or affected by anything and could then land directly into combat anywhere on the battlefield. Many games boiled down to two mighty heroes taking off, battling to the death high above their armies, who got to hang about tossing a few arrows around before the victor landed and annihilated the loser's forces. Number 2, item bloat. Both magic and magical items at this point were built on a card-based system, where any magical item was potentially available for homebrew heroes, including those carried by special characters. Given that at this point characters throughout the rich background of Fantasy Battle were regularly being released through supplements, books and White Dwarf, there were pretty quickly multiple items with complex interactions of which control was conclusively lost. Number 3, save stacking. In the core rules of 4th edition, there are already magical saves, demonic saves and armor saves, all of which could be taken on the same character. This tendency only proliferated with dodge saves, regeneration saves and others, such that characters were regularly protected by 4 or 5 different stacked saves. Number 4, insufficient static combat resolution. Combats in Warhammer Fantasy Battle have always been resolved by some level of combat, resolution. In the earliest editions, this was based on wounds caused alone, but it built in sophistication until 4th edition had a moderately robust level of static resolution. What that means is, there isn't any Warhammer Fantasy Battle combat dynamic resolution score, generally caused by wounds, each wound caused in combat forming part of your score, to see who won the combat. Additionally, there is static resolution, such as a unit standard, adding 1 to your score, something that will inevitably be as true at the end of the combat as it was at the start. Somewhere between, there are things like ranks and flanks, which might change, but generally not too much. However, 4th edition didn't have quite enough to overrule the potentially significant number of wounds hyperpowered characters could cause, and this was exacerbated by 5 no unit champion challenges. Fantasy Battle has always had the option to engage in heroic challenges, where those taking part are unable to attack anyone but their opponent in the challenge. In later editions, normal unit champions could accept and even issue challenges, capping the damage and so the combat resolution that a character could cause. 4th edition lacked this, so only named characters could accept challenges, and as long as the Herohammer avoided them, they could rampage freely through units. Still, 4th edition is a sea change compared to 3rd edition. It's slick and smart. It feels like a game put together by a group of professional game designers, as while 3rd edition feels like an unrestrained garage band of a game. Now, there are plenty of people who love all the peculiar, crusty, old-school oddness of 3rd edition, but for Warhammer Fantasy Battle, there really was no turning back, and it was on to a shining new future. Part of this streamlining and centralising was an effect that made, for me, Warhammer Fantasy Battle such a long-term attraction. In 4th edition, in 1992, a great weapon gave its wielder +2 strength, required 2 hands to wield and made them strike last. In 8th edition, 18 years later, it did exactly the same thing. The same was true for spears, flails, halberds, and a number of other basic elements of the game. The stat line for a basic human in 1992 was 433333117, exactly the same as it was in 2014. If you had a unit in 4th edition to do a particular job in a particular army, it would do more or less the same job in each following edition. Maybe it would need a reform a little, or want a character in or out, and some of the more exotic units would come and go. But if you bought an army in 1992, you'd be using the vast majority of that army over 20 years later, quite happily. That's a feature that made playing Warhammer Fantasy Battle long term deeply comforting to me, and I think many of its fans. Is it something that could be considered a bug from a certain perspective? One that might have contributed to its removal? Who can know? 5th edition was mostly a tidy up, but 6th edition was a little more seismic. Firstly, Rick Priestley was no longer involved with the writing. Secondly, something had to be done about all those rampant magical doodads that I mentioned earlier, and that something was a board wipe. And it was done in what I consider a deeply admirable and generous fashion. This is Ravening Hordes. Well, technically it's the second Ravening Hordes, but to me it's the better one. It's also the supplement that represents my becoming a full-on, full-time Warhammer Fantasy Battle competitive tournament player, and it is, to me, one of the finest things Games Workshop ever did. You see, this was the dark and before times of the year 2000. You couldn't rely on people having the capacity to read a PDF or be on the internet back then. But Warhammer Fantasy Battle was awash with wildly overpowered magical items that no one had the power to corral, so they needed a full system reset. So they made this. And it's brilliant. Some of the lists in here stayed current for 11 years, and it was free. And it was available in any GW store you walked into. And I never once saw it sold out or not available until the majority of the iBooks within it were available. It was a product of a company that cared about supporting its players. It didn't cost 30 quid for access to 4 temporary army lists. Now, apparently when Rick handed over the reins, he said not to muck about with the core rules too much, apart from the magic system. And that's more or less what they did. There is a little tweak in the core rules in that units got a little bit more static combat resolution in the form of outnumbering, and heroes got levelled back by resetting the magical items to something near sane. The magic system of 6th edition introduced an opposed dice-based casting and dispelling system, and the miscast and irresistible force mechanics. Essentially, you roll dice targeting a casting value to cast a spell. Your opponent could then roll dice to beat your value to dispel it, and if you rolled a double 6, the spell could not be stopped. If you rolled a double 1, something terrible happened. It's a simple and, I think, perfect system for the idea of uncertainty and risk versus reward of Warhammer Magic. It was also the main place where players had to make active decisions during a game, and a source of a lot of the meta of the following years. Now, Games Workshop had been running their worldwide mega campaigns for a while. On the fantasy side, it began with A Dark Conspiracy in 1997, launching the, at the time, new Lizardman into 5th edition. This was followed up in 2001 by Warhammer Dark Shadows during 6th edition, which covered the conquest of the weird and rain-soaked island of Albion. The idea of these campaigns was that players anywhere could play a game of Fantasy Battle, record the results with GW, and it would go toward building the result of the campaign, which would, in turn, build the official canon of the world. At first it felt very much that these were more or less GW allowing Jervis Johnson to have some fun. Then they did the Eye of Terror in 2003. Now, in Eye of Terror, players were encouraged to organise strategically when entering their results, and were provided with digital war rooms to do it. It was hugely popular, an order of magnitude more so than all the previous worldwide campaigns, and the players did get organised, although the Chaos players got far better organised. And the result was that a campaign meant to write the storyline of GW's biggest property went in a direction that GW hadn't really predicted or had total control over. Now, those results have been retconned since, but they were honoured for a while. All the worldwide campaigns after were essentially just victory counters, and players were never again encouraged or even allowed to organise their results in the same way. Now, I mention this because something else that happened during 6th edition was Storm of Chaos. This was a worldwide campaign covering Archaon's attempt to ascend to godhood, and it did two things. Firstly, it showed that the old world had space for additional armies. One of the reasons given for the ending of Warhammer Fantasy Battle was that it lacked space for expansion, presumably on the basis that it had 3 fully fledged new army races introduced since its launch, while conversely 40k had, well, 3. Storm of Chaos included 10 new, wildly overpowered army lists, any one of which could have become an entire army book. Secondly, it absolutely failed to advance the storyline one whit. Everything that happened for Storm of Chaos got immediately reset. The Slayer's King took on his oath to free the king, then got humiliatingly squashed flat, so the king just took it up again. Volton rose and died. Archaon made it to Middenheim, then sort of wandered off again. Anything done was immediately undone. The former respect given to the player's achievements and inputs from Dark Shadows was gone, and a little bit of faith was broken. Most of the rest of 6th, 7th and 8th edition's core rules changes were tweaks back and forth, trying to balance the scales between units and heroes or monsters. Stomps and thunderstomps were given to the monsters, horde and steadfast to the units, and that really was about it for Fantasy Battle. But before moving on to the old world, there's clearly an elephant in the room to cover, and that starts with one of the best things to probably ever come out of Games Workshop, a book tasked with resetting the old world. This, Tamarkan. In 2011, 2 years before the beginning of the end times, the brief was given for this book to reset the setting of Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and my god, what could have been? But we didn't get that version of a reset. 2 years later, starting with the Blood of Sigmar, we got this one. And before getting too deeply into this, I'm sure the most OCD viewers would be developing something for Twitch at the sight of 3 hardback slipcased books for a series and 2 softbacks. What you see there is what happens when someone wants a series of books as soon as they're available and isn't too fussy about appearances, sees no particular reason to spend more money than is needed, because the first volumes came out in hardback first, and the later ones released simultaneously because, and you can consider starting a tally at this point, screw you fans! Now, the End Times books were frankly not great. They weren't even good. I'd go so far as to say they were the single worst campaign books ever made in the history of Warhammer Fantasy Battle. But they did have some very, very big miniatures attached. Some very big, expensive miniatures. Sold to some people months before the system they were buying them for was about to be killed because, well... And with that, Warhammer Fantasy Battle was dead. And there was one last insult to its corpse. The last time Games Workshop fully rebooted its fantasy property in a single sweep, we had the very splendid Ravening Hordes. This time people could indeed be expected to download PDFs. And PDFs they got, with things like this. The last time we saw some of these characters was with them giving their lives in a brave but futile stand against the darkness, larger than life and epic in their heroism. And here they were, brought back to us as buffoons and fools. I'm still not entirely sure why that initial 4-page core rule set for Age of Sigmar was what it was. I can only think it was a willful and total break from what had come before, first and foremost. But what was clear was that anyone clinging to past glories were to be shown in no uncertain terms that they would not be returning. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, because there are two ways that GW has presented to us their Forces of Fantasy on a reboot. On the one hand, a set of balanced lists for grown-ups to play, making acknowledgement of what came before while setting out a stall for the future. And on the other, an almost willful mockery of what came before, a sort of sop to those unwilling to toss hundreds of hours and pounds of plastic into the trash. Which way have they fallen with the release of the Old World? Well, on balance, I'd say it's good news. It's certainly not the Age of Sigmar situation. The legacy lists are solid lists, treated with respect. However, I will say I've only read the legacy lists at this point because rather than giving players free get-you-buy lists to start with, other than the two full army lists in the initial release, Bretonnians and Tomb Kings, players have been given the chance to spend £30 on 4 or 5, depending on alignment, good or evil lists. On the one hand, I get it. It's not like theoretically going from 5th edition to 6th edition. Warhammer Fantasy Battle has been dead for more or less a decade. They're not technically servicing an existing fan base that was playing with these armies in GW stores 2 days before the Old World came out. On the other hand, I don't get the feeling these are going to be full and final lists. If some of them are going to be relevant for a limited period of time, I'm not sure how I feel about charging for them. I also don't particularly see the relevance of bundling them together by alignment. Players are as likely to play all elves or all humans as they are all good or all evil, but that's by the by. And since we're now talking about the Old World, let's talk about it. Well, in a second. Before I get going on the analysis, a mini rant if you'll permit me. I'll put it in the time cues, so if you're not interested, feel free to skip ahead. Now, I didn't know I was going to be making this video when Old World came out. I honestly hadn't really considered picking up a copy of it on release. Certainly not enough to think of pre-ordering it or anything. In truth, the last thing that GW made that I picked up even close to release was End Times Archaon. While I've picked up 40k and Age of Sigmar stuff, I've been more than happy to wait until after the initial release, or even pick them up second hand. So while I've been aware of the supply issues of the past few years, I've not experienced them. So once I decided to make this video, I trotted down to the website of an internationally traded company with worldwide branches to order a basic component of a release that presumably they printed enough copies of to cover sales for the next, say, year? Obviously, there were no such thing to be obtained. Because why would there be? So, accepting defeat, I decided to just get the digital version to read, and oh my god! I downloaded 5 EPUB readers because I thought it was me. I went to Reddit and I am informed that it is not me. They know it's like this and they don't care to fix it because pretty much, fuck you. I see a good deal of prototypes and first drafts, things not meant to be particularly pretty, but made with a certain amount of pride. And this? Yes, this list is in reverse order. This is not the only instance of this happening, it is a clusterfuck. Look, I know that a good deal of this video is the story of my long, slow and ongoing emotional divorce from Games Workshop. But if you remember back what I said about Ravening Hordes of the year 2000, the generosity that represented of a company that cared about supporting its players, its fans, and then this piece of crap costs 29 quid and it is a goddamn abomination. It is shameful. I guess somewhere on the internet I could find a PDF rip of the rules, but screw it. This is what they're meant to be, so they're what is staying up throughout this. This version is the best of the 5e readers, by the way. Now, at first glance, the Old World appears to be the direct inheritor of 8th edition. And that would be smart since 8th edition was a good, solid game that had been getting constant feedback and examination for the previous couple of decades. Really, all the Old World had to do was cut and paste 8th, and it really would have been just dandy. They chose not to do that. And after that first glance, there are some, let's say, interesting choices. Up front, an interesting change comes from the fact that the army lists have the addition of specific base sizes. Now, this might potentially seem like a small thing, but bear with me. You see, back in 6th edition, units could still be 4 models wide and claim a rank bonus. You see? No? Right, well, fair enough. So, at first, GW minis were 20mm bases. That just seemed to be the size that was chosen. Then as we got scale creep and we got chunkier and chunkier guys, we ended up with 25mm bases. So if you've got a mix of 20mm and 25mm bases and you care about the aesthetics of units lining up, you need units to be at least 4 models wide. 4 times 25 being 100, and then you can have 5 times 20 being 100, and these can line up very nicely and neatly. Everybody's happy and it looks great. Possibly. But obviously not, because the units on 20mm bases tended to be skinny, weedy things like goblins. And goblins wanted fewer people in the fight and more ranks, so they turned up 4 models wide. Also, 25mm base models tend to be better fighters and wanted more people in combat, so they turned up 6 wide, and it was all very ugly. Now, GW really doesn't like units deeper than they are wide, never have. So in 7th edition, ranks had to be 5 wide, and you often got fighty units like Chosen Chaos Warriors rolling up 7 wide to ensure that they could apply the most possible pointy things to the faces of weaker 5 wide units. Now, while I understand not liking long, skinny units, to the eyes of a historical wargamer, it does look strange to have units apparently in marching order arrayed for fighting on the battlefield. I've never really minded it personally, and frankly, the average GW player probably isn't and has never been a historical gamer. However, in the old world, they have doubled down on this long, skinny thing rage with a really odd little rule stating that units deeper than they are wide get extra movement, while those wider than they are deep claim their rank bonuses and can actually charge. Sort of. Because I'd like to point out a sentence that absolutely breaks my heart for the designer that wrote it. This sentence, which lays out that you can have a cumulative close order combat resolution because nothing in the rules says you can't. You can do anything that the rules don't explicitly say you can't. Oh no! I can only imagine that having written that, the designer, for further jollies, said about stapling a red rag to their crotch before prancing energetically in front of a herd of bulls, because that, right there, is a clear and open invitation to jank. What jank might I be referring to? So glad you asked. Because that rule about units in marching order states that they can't make a charge move. But they are allowed to declare charges. They're allowed to declare charges, but not make charge moves. What exactly does that mean? Well, if you're expecting a clear and concise answer in the rules, you are going to be disappointed. The rules are clear that they definitely can declare a charge, and that you must stop 1 inch away from a unit unless you're going to end in combat with them, and I'm going to go into this in some detail because it is rancid jank and so needs to be clearly laid out. The rules clearly state that a unit in marching column cannot make a charge move. They also clearly state that a unit cannot declare a charge that is impossible for them to complete, and specifically that a unit in marching column can declare a charge. They state you cannot move into combat without declaring a charge, but not that you cannot move into combat without making a charge move. Now, let me be clear. This exists because this is a bad rule set. It is unclearly phrased, and it is unclearly phrased in exactly the places they need to be the most specific. They repeat every banal and obvious rule about 5 times, and then gloss over every rule that the game will actually hinge on with vague haziness. It's as though some sort of twisted rules imp hopped through the rules and picked out every point that uncertainty will ruin the game in and waved a misty wand over it. Nowhere do they clearly state that a charge consists exactly and only of a declaration and then a charge move. Nowhere do they state that ending in combat by marching or normal movement is illegal. But they do explicitly state that a marching column unit cannot make a charge move and that you can only declare a charge that you can complete. As such, rules as written strictly and clearly at least imply that you can end in combat after a triple distance move with a marching column, and nowhere do the rules say you can't. Which means that it's possible that while a character on, say, a monster with fly 9 has a charge between 10 and 15 inches, that a character in a unit in marching order with a 5-inch move has a definite 15-inch, and one in a unit of cavalry with an 8-inch move has a 24-inch threat range. Furthermore, units can't offer supporting attacks on a turn they charged. But it says nothing about marching 15 inches and ending in combat because you can declare charges but not charge move. Now, this could have been pretty easily sorted out with a clear sentence or two, or never come up if the rules were sharp and clean on issues of keywords. But hey, that's what FAQs are for, right? For now, this unit of Savage Orc Ball Riders has a 24-inch threat range with supporting attacks from their spears to the Orc war boss within them. 24 inches looks a bit like that. Got a shooting unit or some artillery? Not for long you don't. That sort of thing carries on throughout the rules. They are a monument to complication and exceptions, and to be honest, remind me more of 3rd edition than 8th when reading through them. Which might or might not be intentional, but we'll get to that later. So, if marching columns work the way that the rules as written imply they do, they are potentially game-breakingly strong. If they don't, they are so useless as to probably never be seen outside of narrative scenarios. Setting that aside for now, the magic system is the next big change for the old world, and it has frankly been made entirely banal. Personally, I find this not just disappointing, but also a little worrying. In relation to the game generally, as we saw in the historic overview, magic has always been a bit of a defining feature for the Fantasy Battle games. Literally, in that magic sort of is what defines fantasy, but also mechanically. Back when it was essentially an RPG, the magic system was baroque and detailed, with spells needing to be recharged and generating fatigue. When it went to a big box product game, magic went to a card-based, product-driven solution. And when Fantasy Battle got made into a slicker at-the-table play experience, it became a choice-heavy, risk and reward-driven system. As such, a magic system that seems to have been designed to remove absolutely all interesting choice is a bit of a concern. In the previous 3 editions of Fantasy Battle, the casting player had to share their power dice around the spells they wanted to cast, forcing them to prioritise limited resources. More dice meant more likely to cast a spell and it not be dispelled, but certain doubles caused devastating miscasts, creating a push your luck mechanic to engage with. When a spell was cast, the opponent had limited dispel dice to try and beat the casting value, extending player choices and tactics. It was the point in Fantasy Battle where the most choices were made beyond the basic process of threat identification and force application. In the old world, spells have been split out into those that are to be used in each phase of the game. When the appropriate phase arrives, you roll 2 dice and add your caster's level to the result to see if you cast a spell or not. If an opponent has a wizard within range, they can roll to dispel it. If not, they get a single 2 dice dispel each round with no range. There is no limit to how many casts you can make, no reason not to cast a spell when you have the chance and it would have an effect on the game, no choice of which spell to cast in which order, no assignment of limited resources, no pushing your luck. Magic is now a simple case of maintaining the ability of your caster to cast as long as possible, threat identification and force application. At the absolute most, you might not cast for fear of hitting a miscast, which, in addition past, could kill your wizard instantly. They can't do that anymore. Miscasts are essentially one or another level of a handful of wounds. So yeah, fuck it, cast if you can. There's one other mid-sized change that is, frankly, an ugly version of a formerly elegant rule, namely break tests. In 4th to 5th edition, if you lost combat, you subtracted the amount you lost by from your leadership, unless you were stubborn or steadfast, in which case you didn't. Then you rolled 2d6 over your leadership and you were running. Neat, simple. Now, you calculate the amount you lost combat by and roll 2d6. If the result is more than your leadership, you flee. If the result is more than your leadership minus the amount you lost by, you retreat in good order, unless you're outnumbered more than 2 to 1, in which case you flee. If the result is less than your leadership minus the amount you lost by, you give ground, being pushed back 2 inches. Pushback combat resolution? Where do I remember that from? Oh yeah, 3rd edition. The upshot being that if you outnumber someone greater than 2 to 1, you'll essentially just be constantly knocked back d6 inches as they repeatedly charge into you. It is frankly fiddly, and other than allowing the refreshment of charge advantages, I'm not entirely sure what its purpose is. I mean, it's not like the game is being released with a starter set trying to sell ancient minis of 2 armies that badly rely on getting repeated charges to function, like loads of knights and chariots or anything, is it? Oh yeah. Now, there are a bunch of small weird things before I move on to the 2 elephants in the room. If you have a high enough ballistic skill, you can re-roll if you miss your initial shot, but the re-roll has a different target number for the sake of needless complexity. However, the second shot doesn't suffer from modifiers, so it could be the same, it could be different, it could be higher, it could be lower. I don't know, maybe he needed to get his eye in with the first shot. Terrain subtracts 1 from your movement value. Before or after you multiply it for marching? No one knows. Have an argument. A clean win is a mere 100 VP. In certain armies, that's 4 troopers. In a game where sides can consist of 100 models each, and it's 100 VP if you're playing with 500 points or 5,000? Oh, and a unit under 25% is worth only 25% of its points in VP, meaning that the last man standing of a unit is worth an insane 75% of its cost. Or maybe it's that they're only worth 25% of their initial points and 75% have been scored, just as long as it's not 50%, so the argument wouldn't matter either way, I guess. Oh, and they ruined giants. In an edition about big monsters, they have made the most iconic Warhammer monster less interesting, less rule-breaking, less powerful, and they removed the fallen giant template. Arseholes. Okay, so let's talk about the perceived problem of Herohammer in the old world. Remember Herohammer from 4th and 5th edition? Well, it's back, sort of. The thing with big monsters in a game of ranked up units is that their perception for casual players is a bit of a cursed problem. To explain, one of the first reactions I've seen to the old world has amounted to, hey, when I face something that's built to do a single job with something that's both cheaper and not built to do that job, I lose. That seems to be a problem. Which, even in relation to the new meta of a new game, really seems to be a strange response. Let's be clear, if you take on something really expensive and really good at fighting, by fighting it with something less good at fighting, you will, and should, lose. You deal with a problem like this with combat resolution. Now, this has been made harder by reduction in combat resolution. See, in the last few editions of Fantasy Battle, a bog standard, cheap as chips, ranked up unit had a combat resolution of 5. 3 ranks, standard, outnumber. Challenge resolution tops out with a single wound opponent, like a unit champion, at a maximum of 6. This means that a 600 point Blender Lord on a dragon running into a unit a fraction of their points would be unlikely to break them on the charge, and with even a small bump in static resolution, the unit would win. Meaning that characters or monsters had to be used carefully and were only good at specific jobs, which, when you spent a ton of points and cash on a big centerpiece model, sort of sucks. So combat resolution has been dropped down a little bit. Now, that unit is sitting on a combat resolution of 4. That might not seem like a big change, but many units can take their own magical standard upgrades, including the War Banner, which provides a point of combat resolution, bringing the static resolution to 6, and units with full commands, including musicians, which will win drawn combats with those without them. A unit upgrade standard doesn't need to be made visually obvious to an opponent, while a battle standard bearer does. As such, that point drop in resolution changes charging with a Herohammer from a high-risk guessing game to a far safer prospect. The response remains fairly simple, though. A fast-moving, close-order unit with a battle standard waiting on the flanks. If anything, with some of the changes to charge ranges, particularly flying charges in the old world, it's become even easier to deal with. Here, the High Elf on Phoenix has a very failable charge into these Night Goblins. So they declare the charge, they come in. The Night Goblin unit champion challenges out. The Phoenix is going to win by a maximum of 2 points because the Goblins are sitting on 4 points of static combat res, and the best that the Phoenix can hope for is 6. Let's say the battle standard, which is going to be just over here in these orcs waiting to charge the flank, and the general in range. The Night Goblins probably either give ground or most likely retreat in good order. So it's going to be back to here. And then the next turn, the Goblins are going to charge in. The Boar Boys have an unfailable charge available here. They're going to roll into the flank. And then the Boar Boy champion is going to challenge out the Phoenix. We've got 4 points of combat resolution from the Goblins, 4 points of combat resolution from the Boar Boys with a battle standard, possibly with a bonus battle standard ability, because the close order for the Boar Boys is going to count additionally in this combat. This time the Phoenix is going to lose by at least 2 points of combat resolution, and now that it's outnumbered, if it retreats it won't be in good order. It'll flee, the Boar Boys might run it down. Certainly it's going to have been taken out of the game for anything more than a couple of unit champions for the majority of play. Now if, for example, this was a High Elf Lord on Dragon, this was a unit of Dark Elf City Guard, this is a unit of Cold Ones with Noble for battle standard, then these guys are going to cost around about 470 points. This guy's going to cost a bare minimum of 400 and probably going to be considerably more expensive. And more to the point, these guys can do a whole bunch of different jobs. This guy can only really do this. It's not an advantageous position. The thing is that this, Herohammer, has always been a casual meta. It's dominated in clubs and bedrooms, but it doesn't tend to go very far in tournaments. It'll often turn up in the early rounds, but not really show very much further on. Now, monsters have always turned up at tournaments. Dark Elf, Lord on Dragon and Greater Demons have always been there in dominant lists, but as a support unit rather than something that's going to pile in and take out an entire opposing army. On the subject of demons and Dark Elves, it's interesting to me that over the legacy lists, in there are demons, dark elves, and vampire counts. 3 of the most dominant tournament lists in 8th edition. The last GW tournament I went to, probably a third of the armies were one of those 3 lists. They've gone in and they've taken them out, and there are arguments for why dark elves and vampire counts might not be in the old world. But demons are eternal. If they're there in one period of time, they should be there in all of them. But the sorts of players who care about what is tournament legal already own those 3 armies. You can't necessarily get them to buy them again on the new release. So is Herohammer going to be a serious dominant meta? I think probably not. But is there going to be given enough time for it to shake out? Is GW going to give it the space to sort itself out? I don't know. With some of the evidence from 40k recently, I'm really not sure. Now, interestingly, there was a day when if a monster had its rider slain, there was a set of tests to take that could result in the monster going out of control. Rider and monster were separate entities. In the old world, a monstrous mount adds stats directly to the hero, so they all get taken off at once. In a game as complex and narrative as the old world, it's an odd change. Now, it's fairly easy to take down a monster. They tend to have very poor saves, relying on high toughness and wounds. Meanwhile, heroes have relatively few wounds, so you only need to get a couple of hits past what are inevitably stacked and boosted saves. If the two are separate, each takes on the weaknesses of the other. But once you combine the wounds and toughness of a monster with the saves of a hero, beating them directly in combat becomes extremely tough. Ironically, of course, the great weakness of a powerful hero is the ability to champion challenge them out and static combat res break them. So in a sense, it doesn't matter how hard they are to beat directly in combat. Ultimately, this has happened before. There are times when the great brains at Games Workshop decide that what should be the focus of play is big monsters. As Gav Thorpe said in a recent essay, if I have 15 halberdiers attacking a dragon, is the narrative in which halberdier does what damage, Sammy's rolling notwithstanding, is it in the overall confrontation, or is it in the massive freaking dragon? Not a single special rule needs to be written for our halberdiers in this situation. When they are fighting another 15 halberdiers, we roll our dice, resolve it quickly and move on. The narrative, the rules mechanics to allow greater potential for narrative, should reside with the dragon. It breathes fire and may get special attacks. It loses strength as it is wounded. It can fly and cause terror and all sorts of other exciting things that break the normal rules. And it can have these things because we only have 1 or 2 dragons in the army. This means 2 things. Firstly, any fight involving a dragon is automatically special and more likely to give rise to an interesting story. Secondly, when a dragon fights a dragon, it has the chance of becoming an epic story. And then it rolls on, and somebody decides that it should be about mighty serried ranks, the mass battle of a mass battle, that heroes should be standing with their men, leading them shoulder to shoulder. Someone remembers that a dragon eating a unit isn't actually a good story, the man striking the dragon down is, and the balance of power shifts in the rules. I remember when 6th edition first launched, everyone was coming out from under the heel of Herohammer, and the standard meta in my local community was for 1500 point games. It took most of the way to 7th edition for people to finally start accepting 2000 points as a standard. I've already heard 1 or 2 commentators suggesting 1500 points or 1999 points to overcome the perceived problem of Herohammer. Personally, I think that's not necessary. But personal viewpoints don't really shape metas, and sadly, unless you really know what you're doing, neither do game designers. Anyway, on to... So, talking of metas, let's address the other meta elephant in the room that people have been talking about, Linehammer. Before we get into the actual Linehammer phenomena and its issues, I just want to take note of a little something. You can now make full unit-wide stand and shoot reactions, even if the unit is not entirely in range. They did it! They went and did it! The fools! They have unleashed the Nobbler Hellstorm and doomed us all. In 8th edition, it was observed that since Nobblers were 2 and 1/2 points each, you could purchase enough of them to span from one side of the table to the other. Since they have thrown weapons with multiple shots, which would then involve rolling nearly 2,000 dice, anything would be cut to shreds by the sheer weight of probability on charging them, so they would be unbeatable. This failed for 3 reasons. 1, at a base size of 20mm and a price of 2.5 points, to span from one table edge to the other takes 914 Nobblers for 2,285 points, and you still have to buy a general. While 2,500 points was an increasingly popular meta in 8th edition, it wasn't universal. 2, in 8th edition, a unit couldn't make a stand and shoot reaction till all members of the unit were within range of the charger. Since a charger could be 6 feet from some members of the unit, they would never be in range and never get a stand and shoot. 3, you can only stand and shoot a single enemy. However, now, at a base size of 25mm and a price of 2 points, to span from one table edge to the other takes 731 Nobblers at a price of 1,462 points. Plenty left over for a general, and actually 1 or 2 of those large monster mounted ogre bits of artillery. Now, stand and shoots have infinite range. Put them into 7 units of 100, that's still 200 shots each, on average hitting and wounding on 5s, that's 22 wounds. And now, wounds caused by a stand and shoot count towards combat resolution. I can't specify clearly enough, don't do this, but at least we know now why ogres are a legacy list. Anyway, Linehammer. What is it, where does it come from, and what needs to be done about it? Well, Linehammer is based upon one odd little rule in Old World, which is that every model in the fighting rank, which is the rank that has models in contact with the enemy, gets to fight. Doesn't matter if they're nowhere near the enemy, doesn't matter if your unit is 100 models wide, because you're trying to spam an insane stand and shoot rule. They all get to fight. So just in case you missed it, wounds caused by a stand and shoot now count towards combat resolution. And people are worried about long strung out close combat units. So clearly people have gotten rather excited about whatever. Chaos Chosen 40 models wide, putting out 80 strength 5 attacks and such like. Oh, the humanity. Such a thing would be game-breakingly powerful and result in armies ridiculous to the eye. Let's all complain about it. Which begs the question, why did it happen? Well, to fix something that many people always considered a problem in Fantasy Battle. Actually, before I picked up Old World to read, and before either of us had ever heard the term Linehammer, Mike informed me quite happily that they'd fixed the who gets to fight problem, and that was certain to be a good thing.
Hey Glenn, did you see the latest Old World dev diary? It says they fixed that thing where you had to shuffle the characters around to fight in challenges, and instead everyone in the front rank gets to fight. That's going to be so much better.
Poor, sweet, trusting, naive Mike. I knew immediately that they had fucked something up. So traditionally, the way that you could tell who was fighting in a combat in a game of Warhammer Fantasy Battle was you line 2 units up, and if 2 guys would be touching without movement trays, they could fight. So for example here, everybody can fight at the moment. Now if we get to here, this guy can't, and these 2 guys can't. If we get to here, only these 2 guys and these 3 guys can fight, and so on. For some reason, this broke some people's fucking brains. I don't know why, but it just consistently did. In order to solve it, GW have totally washed their hands of it. In the Old World, if you're in the front rank, you get to fight. The thing is, that would be fine, provided that nobody ripped the arse out of it. I guarantee 5 minutes after that rule was released to the general public, somebody was building a 2 foot wide, 25mm deep movement tray. The thing is that the rules problems of Linehammer are legion. Let's take a simple one like closing the door. The rules state that when 2 units meet, the charging unit has to maximise contact if it can, unless an obstacle blocks the way. And if an obstacle does block the way, the other unit has to close up. Now, with a normal sort of unit, 4 or 5 models wide, this is never going to be a problem. The odds of both units being blocked are astronomical. With 2 Linehammer units, let's take a look. So here's an example of 2 Linehammer style units charging. Let's say the demons have just charged in. Maybe they started back from over here. They're a fairly reasonable width unit, but a bit Linehammery, whereas the Savage Orcs have gone, full width Linehammer. If the demons did start back over here, as we can see, it is a front charge, because checking the arc of the Orcs, the demons are majority in the front arc of the Orcs. Now we've got to close the door and bring the 2 units together. Well, the demons can't move in because that would involve this demon moving backwards, which they're not allowed to do. Similarly, the Savage Orcs can't move in because that would involve this Orc moving over 20 inches, well over half their movement distance. So what do? Well, reasonable players would probably just say, leave them as they are and get on with the game. But reasonable players probably wouldn't have turned up with units arrayed like this. So what's actually going to happen? Arguments, disagreements, not really enjoying the game. Increasingly, I suspect that that's part of the point of the Old World, but we'll get onto that sort of thing in a minute. In addition, characters in a Linehammer unit become totally invulnerable to damage. The rules state that characters can only be hit by attacks directed at them by those in base contact with them. They are not required to be in the middle of the unit, and they can still attack despite not themselves being in base contact with the enemy. So shove them at the far end of a Linehammer conga and giggle as they basically stand with their hand on a little guy's head while kicking them right in the balls. Now, there is a glimmer of hope in that you can only fight if models from your fighting row are in contact with the enemy. It doesn't state when this is checked, and casualties are removed in initiative order. So arguably, since models in a Linehammer unit are stepping up, they're not in base contact when it comes to their turn. So their entire rank is ineligible to fight. Well, at least it would be a glimmer of hope if fighters in a Linehammer unit stepped forward. There are rules to specify that stepping forward fighters can't fight in combat and have a rules status. Linehammer fighters don't step forward, they close in. What is the rule status of closing in? Is it like stepping forward? Is it different? Absolutely no fucker knows. It's only mentioned to differentiate it from the defined stepping forward, and it never comes up again because why would you bother making sure that the rules pertaining to the absolutely batshit game-breaking thing you casually slapped into the middle of the rules are really clear? So, Linehammer is a thing. It makes elite units very hard to beat since they can have as many attacks as they like, and unlike monsters, you can't challenge out the threat in a Linehammer unit. Is this a problem? Well, I don't think so. Not really, because it has two simple solutions and actually builds an interesting meta if you think about it. Solution 1, Herohammers. Herohammers absolutely ruin Linehammers, and ranked units embarrass Herohammers, and Linehammers wreck up ranked units. Warhammer is an intransitive game. It's always been a rock, paper, scissors thing. It encourages taking all three things in an army and trying to line them up against the right thing of the opponent. Solution 2. A thing is really great in the combat phase and absolutely terrible in the movement phase. How can we possibly beat it? With movement. It's possible that a big enough Linehammer unit can't legally reform, and all of them struggle to wheel. Elite units fanning to 10 wide to take a charge, I really don't think that's actually a problem. A unit 20 models wide, just roll around their flanks. They can't wheel, they can't reform, screw them. Linehammer is a rules nightmare. It's not an overpowered meta. I actually think a few thin red lines and fanning out as battle lines meet would be quite cool. So anyway, Old World is considerably more complex than 8th edition. Partly because a good deal of the rules are unclear and often directly contradictory. Now, if you recall, I mentioned that a significant part of the aim of Games Workshop games is to be easy to pilot and casual to play, so surely the willfully complex Old World is a clear failure. Well, not necessarily. Complexity is not necessarily an enemy of casual play. In fact, potentially the opposite. Complexity with minimal challenging choices creates process gaming, the holy grail of casual tabletop play. Think of it this way. If I tell you to make a boeuf bourguignon, then you've got a quite active engagement ahead of you. Maybe research, maybe experimentation, certainly some learning of technique. If I give you a 1,000-step set of instructions, including every knife stroke and stirring element, your actual engagement is far simpler. The second process is far more complex to directly engage with, but far more casual. Following those instructions would totally fail to engage you mentally. Old World is further down this path than Fantasy Battle ever was. For example, the magic phase is more complex, now split across multiple phases, but far less engaged since there are no actual resources to expend and meaningful choices to make. Break tests now appear to give choices, as every combat will end with a decision whether to follow up or not. But that's going to be an entirely perfunctory choice 99% of the time. Generally, it's just going to be a step of additional complexity. The core game here is more of a process, more supporting that engagement that GW seeks. So, who is the old world for? Well, remember at the top when I mentioned the hobby trumpet? GW owns the thick end of the hobby trumpet, the newly minted neophyte players. They are totally in control of that end of the market, with very little in the way of competition, but they've conclusively lost the rest of it. And for a long time, they've stopped fighting for it. Old World is their land grab for the more experienced cognoscenti further down the tube. Old World has been presented to those in the know as a passion project by some of the studio loose cannons. It's harkening back to 3rd edition pretty hard. 3rd edition where things were weird and wild, a halcyon time that those in the know appreciate like a fine wine and an acquired taste. Old World is a temptation to those in the know. Remember those clunky old minis from a time before taste? We're bringing them back. Remember pushback combats? We're bringing them back. Remember special rules that lasted for 20 pages? They're coming on back. Sure, it's got loopholes you could drive a truck through, but you're better than someone who would exploit those, aren't you? Sure, it literally doesn't make sense in a few places, but you're keen to house rule some stuff and overlook some stuff, aren't you? The way they did back in the 80s. Even if you started playing in the 90s or the thousands, or screw it, in the 20s. So long as you're nostalgic for a period you never participated in, it's shooting for those who know better. And honestly, whatever. Best of luck to it. I'm not going back to it. Sure, I'll probably play it at some point. I mean, I'm kind of pot committed. Little because I'm a game designer and GW will always be the biggest game in town. And mostly just for old time's sake. And that's for a few reasons. It's lost the most important thing that it bought for me. That reliability. I didn't play Warhammer because I loved it. I played Warhammer because I could rely on it. At some point in the late 90s, I went into a local bicycle shop with a friend. We had recently decided to get back into Warhammer on the basis that we were practically grown-ups now and could afford any army we damn well pleased rather than scraping and building things out of shoeboxes. For some reason, the closest physical shop to us at that point that sold GW stuff was this bike shop. They had one spinning stand of minis blisters. Most of them were 40k. Of the fancy ones that were there, some were elves, and my friend always had dibs on elves. There were some dwarves, and my friend with Swedish roots had a perpetual claim on those. What was left was this. So I bought it, and I built a demon army. I was still using that demon army in 2015, some 20 years later, when Warhammer Fantasy Battle came to an end with the advent of the end times. That sort of reliability is incredible in the miniatures wargaming world. Through those 20 years, I could be certain that wherever I was, any gaming club I went into, those demons would make me certain of being able to get in a game. Everywhere had at least a handful of Warhammer willing players. Even if I couldn't play in a club, while GW stores aren't exactly Starbucks, you're never more than an hour or so drive from one, or at least a decent sized stockist. The reliability was valuable to me. It allowed me to build friendships, gave me a way into clubs where I didn't know anyone, and eased my moving to a new town or city more than once. Christ, I met my wife in a GW store. It was a ticket of safety in a hobby of bewildering breadth and regular churn. It gave me a comfort. I never had a moment's doubt investing in new Warhammer models. Why would I? What other gaming piece would I get more value from? The thing I valued most from Warhammer Fantasy Battle was trust. The thing with trust is, once you break it, it's gone. I didn't believe that Games Workshop would end the Warhammer world with the end times. I really didn't. The main reason I didn't believe it was they'd just sold a lot of people a lot of models and books. If they ended the system they sold them for just months after selling them, in a manner that they knew they'd be doing when they sold them, well, that would be taking the biggest draw to their games, that reliability, and setting it on fire before flushing it down the toilet. So they wouldn't do that, would they? Well, obviously they would, because they did. And in doing that, they lost me. It doesn't really matter to me how good Old World is. Warhammer isn't my game now. And it never can be again, and not because it's been dead for a while. I play plenty of dead systems. I was lucky enough to study at an American university for part of my degree. It was a great time out on my own as a young guy. During that time we rented, well, stole would be a better term, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas from the local Blockbusters, and watched it constantly in various states of intoxication.
We can't stop here. This is bad country.
That's still a good film, but if I go back to it now, it won't be the same. Not because it's changed, but because I have. Every piece of art is defined as much by who you are when you experience it as what it is itself. I last played Warhammer Fantasy Battle around 8 years ago. Since that time, I've become a father. I've moved into a new house. I've changed. I've gotten older. I ache in the places where I used to play, and Fantasy Battle just hasn't been there for that. I'm a different person now, and going back to it expecting it to chime with me again would be like expecting to get the same experience from Fear and Loathing as I did when I was a teenager spinning out on a shrooms. It wouldn't be fair to either of us. Seeing the Old World now for me is like catching sight of an old friend you haven't seen in years at a social event and knowing you're never going to really talk again, either there or later, because neither of you really wants to. You're both doing fine, you both know that what is past, and neither of you wants to go back to being the person who really wanted to be around the other one. It's strange and bittersweet. Companies look to monetize nostalgia as though it's pure positivity. Nostalgia was originally defined as a mental illness. Honestly, I think a lot of the negative reactions to Old World from some people I've seen come down to, why doesn't this make me feel the way it used to? As though that's something a game can come close to dealing with. Things change. Not everything is for you. Old World isn't my game. It was never meant to be, and it can't be. I wish it all the success in the world. I'll follow its progress with interest. It is what it is. Look, I know that took a while, but it's probably clear at this point that Fantasy Battle has been with me for a long time, and I wanted to consider my take on the Old World carefully. If you enjoy it, know that I want you to enjoy it. I really do. I want people to feel about it the way that once upon a time I felt about Fantasy Battle. My love may be dead, but it doesn't mean I want no one to ever love again. I think it's been a worthwhile analysis of what is clearly one of the year's big releases, and even if it wasn't, I wanted to do this. If you're a lapsed GW fan, an Old World is calling to you and might bring you back into the GW fold, or for that matter, if it isn't, I would absolutely love to hear your take on it. I've really enjoyed making this video, researching and spending a bit of time on it, and I'd love to do more of these deep dives doing the same thing for other systems. I don't think any others would be as rich, and I know none will be as personal as this one, but I think they'd still be interesting. If there's a rule system you'd like to see me do a deep dive on, please let me know in the comments. And if this video has been interesting to you, please hit on the like and subscribes. This did take a fair amount of time and effort, so it's really important to me to know if people found it interesting and what they'd find interesting in the future. But for now, from this deep dive and from Rule of Carnage, it's going to be a thank you and a goodbye. Goodbye.